Hello, and welcome to a bonus box of Warhammer 40k's Grim History from Beyond. I'm Zeckthar, and this week we'll be continuing Darnath Lysander's story, and concluding his tale with the Infestation of Drashin. Now, to give a brief recap of where we left off, Lysander and the Third Company of the Imperial Fists were making excellent progress against the Orcs at the Magor Rift when they got a distress call. Vladimir Pug had sent the call because a Tyranid infestation had taken root in the Drashin system. At less than 100 light-years from Terra, this placed the rapacious Xenos a mere stone throws from the Imperium's hot. Therefore, the chapter master of the Imperial Fists, Vladimir Pug, had ordered all Imperial Fist strike forces, including Lysander's Crusade of Thunder, to be summarily recalled to confront this threat. And thus, we return to our heroes on the battle barge, the Storm of Wrath, entering the Drashin warp space, and unfortunately found the world heaving beneath the mass of Tyranid swarms. The roots of the infestation could be seen even from orbit, millions of dark carapaces blending together to form roving lakes that left nothing but bare rock and wasteland in their wake. The crisis on Drashin had begun some solar weeks earlier, when an unnamed space hulk had materialized out of the warp on a direct heading for the planet. Judging by its crude hull adornments, the vessel had lately been under Orc command, but other than a marked deceleration in its approach, there had been no sign of life aboard as it crashed through the Adeptus Mechanicus picket fleet and collided with Drashin itself. Much of the space hulk had been destroyed by the Mechanicus ships, or else had burned up in the planet's thick atmosphere, but enough of it had survived to wreak calamity on the planet below, causing the world to shift slightly on its orbit and throwing up a cloud of particulated matter that had choked away the sun. Drashin's planetary crust was incredibly brittle, and the impact had all but obliterated an entire continent, leaving jagged obsidian platelets scattered across a seething ocean of magma. But the worst was yet to come. As the crust of cooling rock hardened around the Space Hulk's hull, the Tyranid swarms had emerged from rents in the vessel's flanks. The magma ocean around the impact site had provided little in the way of biomass, but the jungles further to the west had proved a more tempting target. Before help could arrive, a swarm already glutted on the Space Hulk's previous occupants had blossomed to many times its original size. Under the circumstances, orbital bombardment, or even exterminatus, would have been a prudent course. However, the relief force's orders had been explicit. The Tyranid infestation was to be ended with minimal harm to the planet itself. Why? Well, it's an interesting question. One, the captain of the Spear of Vengeance, another Imperial Fist battle barge that had answered the call for aid, did not know the reason, only that it had come from Terra itself. Why didn't really matter to Lysander? After all, it was their duty to follow orders. I mean, it didn't matter, yet Lysander could hazard a guess. You see, there was an Adeptus Mechanicus archaeological outpost on Drashin's northern pole, and it had been there for thousands of years. Whatever it was the servants of the Omnici were looking for, it was clear that they didn't want it accidentally destroyed, even in circumstances as dire as these. Now, the price of such restraint was quickly paid. Even with the arrival of the Astra Militarim's Catachan 31st Regiment, millions of Imperial citizens had perished, with millions more on the brink. In fact, by the time the Imperial Fists had arrived, the determined jungled fighters had slowed the Tyranid advance, but only at the cost of a further 2 cities and many thousands of their own warriors. Now the swarm was deep into Drashin's largest continent, and the Adeptus Mechanicus polar base remained secure only through the efforts of the Legio Magna's Titans and a muster of knights from House Krast. As matters had transpired, Chapter Master Vladimir Pug's task force, comprising some 4 companies in the Imperial Fists, had arrived only one Drashin day before the Storm of Wrath. Pug knew that there had been instances of gene-stealer infestation aboard Space Hulks since the Sin of Damnation incident involving the Blood Angels nearly 400 Terran years previously in 589.M41. But seldom before had there been any record of a full-fledged Tyranid swarm aboard such a vessel. Pug had taken this to mean that the Space Hulk's mangled skin concealed at least one Norn queen, though how one of the brood mothers of the Tyranid swarms had come to be aboard the vessel, he couldn't even fathom, and had elected to lead a strike straight at the infestation's heart.
unwilling to risk a drop pod descent onto the Space Hulk's magma-strewn surroundings. Poog had led an assault via Thunderhawk gunship. Nearly half a solar day had passed, but no communication had been heard from him since. Hearing this, Lysander ordered his troops immediately to follow Poog's path, to bring aid to his chapter master if he still lived, and to avenge him if he did not. Yielding command of the tactical squads to Sergeant Tor Garradon once more, Lysander led the Centurions and his 2 dreadnoughts to another Thunderhawk and departed into the atmosphere. The Crusade's Thunderhawks met resistance as soon as they entered Drashin's upper atmosphere. Winged bioconstructs flew shrieking through the skies, acidic venom spurting from their chitinous weaponry. The spray hissed and sizzled wherever it struck a Thunderhawk, and the pilots were forced into dizzying evasive maneuvers. Smaller Tyranid beasts swirled around the descending strike craft. Their shots barely scratched the hull, but their brittle bodies clogged the innards of the turbofan engines. With a shriek of tortured metal, Garradon's Thunderhawk plunged from the sky, avoiding collision with the ground below only through its pilot's deft skill. Undercarriage screamed and buckled. The front half of the craft slewed to a halt on one of the larger platelets. Its stern was not so fortunate, and was already threatening to sink into the magma, taking its precious cargo with it. Once again, the Thunderhawk's pilot proved his worth, coaxing enough life out of the craft's failing thrusters to hold the flyer stable whilst its passengers disembarked into the spore-choked air. By the time the thrusters finally gave out, the transport bay was empty. Only the brave pilot perished as the Thunderhawk slipped beneath the surface of the burning sea. His life, a small yet noble price, willingly given so that his battle brothers could fight on. Garradon's Demi company had avoided death thus far, but it still waited to claim them. The rocky islands were swarming with Tyranids, and the nearest creatures broke off to engage them, effortlessly leaping the magma channels that lay in their path. Bolt guns roared, and the first wave of gaunts was blasted to ichor-spattered bone. But Garradon knew the volley had bought only a little time. He could see larger bio-beasts moving in the direction, and he knew that to stand his ground was to be overwhelmed. Yet just then, a thermal current briefly parted the spore clouds, and the sergeant caught sight of the Imperial Fist's 7th and 9th Company banners, standing proud on the nearby summit. Pausing only to slam another magazine home into his bolt pistol, Garradon ordered the advance. Meanwhile, on what the 7th Company's chaplain had wryly referred to as Bleak Ridge, before a strangled beast had torn apart, Captain Jonas had resolved to die with pride. Before him lay the wreckage of 3 Thunderhawk gunships. Behind him, the Space Hulk's flank towered into the sky. Hours earlier, Poog had led the 1st and 5th Companies through a rent of adamantium Leviathan's hide, ordering that Captain Jonas and Terrell to hold their battle brothers back to act as a rearguard. Initially, the combined firepower of the 7th and 9th Companies had been more than a match for the Tyranids, but about a solar hour previously, the swarm had grown in size and flown into a desperate frenzy. Jonas didn't care why. He knew only that he could keep firing until his magazine ran dry, and he would then tear the beast apart with his bare hands until strength finally left him. Captain Terrell could do little of either, for he had been blinded by a spray of acid, but he still took pride in his battle brother's efforts as he bellowed encouragement. It mattered not that they were the reserve companies. On this day, they fought with a vigor fit to shame the veterans of 100 younger chapters. Another wave of termagants massed beneath the Bleak Ridge, and Jonas prepared to sally to clear the slopes, as he had done a dozen times since taking up position. Tyranid warriors and carnifexes were advancing in a middle distance, and he wanted a chaff cleared away before they reached his line. The captain raised his power sword high, but before he could give the order, bolter shells hammered out of the spore clouds to the west, and the 3rd Company crashed into the swarm of gaunts. Garradon led the charge. Chaplain Markov came close behind, his voice raised in wrathful litany. Moments later, 3 banners stood proud atop Bleak Ridge, and the next Tyranid attack wave fared no better than those that had come before it. Taking up position amongst the 7th Company's battle-depleted squads, the 3rd sent salvo after salvo into the advancing Tyranid warriors, leaving the heavier weapons of the 9th Company Devastator squads to focus their fire on the monsters beyond. Yet even still the Tyranids came, hurling themselves at Bleak Ridge. Again and again bolters roared. The air whistled to the shrill reports of plasma guns and missile launchers, but still, the swarm crashed against the Imperial Fist's line. Pteranodophyxes stomped forward, the sprays of flesh-boar beetles rattling against power armor before las cannons brought them down. Spore mines exploded upon the ridge, killing or injuring the Space Marines in 1 and 2s. Tyrell was still at the rear, bellowing encouragement at his brothers, all the while ignoring the searing pain from his ravaged eyes. Jonas was still issuing orders, his voice brittle with his hatred for the creatures that mustered below. Increasingly, though, those Imperial Fists who fought on the heights now listened for Garradon's calm voice as he directed defenders' fire, with an efficiency learned over 30 Terran years of service and honed under Lysander's tutelage. But then, a Biotitan emerged out of the swirling spores, and Garradon knew that the ridge was lost. He was about to order his brothers to withdraw inside the Space Hulk, when an ear-splitting boom sounded overhead. Lysander had arrived, yet his Thunderhawk had fared only a little better than Garradon's during the descent. A glancing collision with a Harridan had sent the flyer spiraling out of control and away from the battle. In the end, it had made a jarring touchdown some 80 Terran kilometers from Garradon's position, and Lysander had watched with growing and impotent fury as Brother Karazhan struggled to restore the wounded gunship to full function. The skies above had been kept relatively clear by the storm talons of the Sword of Pollux, who had shredded any winged bio-beast that strayed too close. Now, after a fraught delay, Lysander's Thunderhawk joined the battle for Bleak Ridge. A barrage of fire from the Thunderhawk's turbo laser and Hellstrike missiles tore great holes in the Biotitan. The Hierophant gave a thunderous roar and brought its bio-cannon about to target the newcomers. It stumbled forward as a volley of las cannon fire from Bleak Ridge sheared off one of its forelegs. Before the beast could recover, a second shot from the Thunderhawk's turbo laser tore its skull to ruin and toppled over into the pool of lava. Coming in low, Lysander's gunship swept across the battlefield, its heavy bolters tracking synapse nodes and drowning them in heavy-caliber shells. At once, the Tyranid swarm shuddered as the feedback rolled through the hive mind. As the attackers recoiled, the Thunderhawk touched down on Bleak Ridge, and Lysander led the Centurions out into the battle. After receiving reports from Garradon and Jonas, Lysander ordered his 2 dreadnoughts to join the defense on the ridge, and then led the Centurions into the heart of the Space Hulk. It wasn't long before Lysander lost track of time during his journey through the Space Hulk's corroded and pitted corridors. The captain could have been traveling for solar hours, or days, or weeks. He neither knew nor cared. All that mattered to Lysander was that his old company and his chapter master were somewhere in the darkness ahead. He still couldn't make contact with Vladimir Pug and any member of the First Company, though his sensors registered several other suits of Terminator armor, several Terran kilometers in the distance. Lysander made no account of the creatures he slew within the Space Hulk's tangled passageways. Gargoyles screeched out of the darkness, wings flailing madly. Gene stealers dropped from ceilings or emerged from crawl spaces, talons lashed out at the intruders. All the attackers perished, pulverized under the crushing impact of his Fist of Doom relic Thunderhammer, or blown apart by Centurion salvos. After a close-fought battle in which a crackling Trigon claimed 2 Centurion lives, Lysander's strike force found a working conveyor, which carried them deep into the vessel at phenomenal speed. When they stepped off the conveyor, they found the walls subsumed by pulsating organic matter that spat acid and lashed at them with vestigial tendrils. Torn scraps of flesh marred the corridors, the remains of sphincter portals shredded by the First Company's chain fists. The carapaces of tiny bioforms crunched underfoot at every step, and seething fluid dribbled down the waxy walls to collect in folds and hollows. Lysander could hear the sounds of battle echoing through the corridors now, and the sensor outlines of his fellow Terminators were solid where before they had been hazy. At no point did the tide of Tyranids cease, but Lysander was too close to his destination to yield. As Lysander's strike force began carving their own path through the swarm, the captain finally could put eyes on Vladimir Pug, who was trying to make another advance into the enemy. A hive tyrant moved to block the chapter master's path, and he was hurled back in a spray of blood, but Pug was not so easily thwarted. Rising to his feet, Pug came forward again, the hand of judgment. His mighty and ancient power fist crackled as energy fields played around it. The monster's legs collapsed under Pug's first punch, its torso under the second. High above the battle, a fresh brood of gene-stealers burst forth from the Norn Queen's birthing pouches to scuttle down the walls. 3 Terminators forced their way forward, thunder hammers crackling as they swept the packed waves of Gaunt's aside. A Carnifex slammed into them, the impact sending 2 staggering backwards as its claws sliced through the third's armor. But the intervention had bought Poog time. Gathering the Relic Hand of Judgment's power into a fist, the Chapter Master stepped over the Hive Tyrant's corpse and punched forward, buckling the chitinous plates that crowned the Carnifex's head and ravaging an eye cluster. As the beast reared back in pain, several Centurions found their mark. Las cannons blazed, burning the blackened hole through the Carnifex's torso. However, even as the beast collapsed in its death throes, its mace-shaped tail scattered Poog's bodyguard and knocked the Chapter Master from his feet. That was all the time the Gene Stealers needed, and they were on Poog in a heartbeat, claws tearing at the ceramite of his armor. Other members of the First Company surged forward, acting Captain Julian amongst them, but Julian was snatched to oblivion by the Trigon's flailing claw, and more Gene Stealers pressed forward to prevent the survivors' advance. Poog lashed out again and again as he tried to regain his feet, but the foe were too many. The Hand of Judgment crackled furiously one last time, and then the Chapter Master vanished beneath the Batalon tide and was torn limb from limb. Vladimir Poog, Chapter Master of the Imperial Fist, was slain. With a great cry of rage and loss, Darnath Lysander forged forward through the swarms, driving the Gene Stealers back from his slain Chapter Master. With him came the Centurions and the survivors of the 1st and 5th Companies, their limbs finding fresh strength as they vented their fury at Poog's death. Yet though they reclaimed the bloody ground upon which his dismembered corpse lay, they could advance no further. High above, more birthing pouches split open, disgorging ever more and ever larger bioconstructs into the fight. It was then that the noble Astartes saw their true foe in this hellish hulk of bugs, the Norn Queen herself. Seeing their true enemy, las cannons were now turned on the Norn Queen, but the shots glanced off her carapace. A chain fist could have done the job perhaps, or a thunderhammer. But the target suspended so high, it was impossible to bring the weapons to bear. It seemed that the Imperial fist would have to retreat or be overwhelmed. But neither Lysander nor Hagen were prepared to trade the lives of their fallen battle brothers for such ignominious defeat. Yet little by little, amidst the horror and fury of that cavern, Lysander realized that the situation was far too grim for his liking. He was surrounded and outnumbered, and if he didn't order the retreat, more lives would be lost. It took the death of his Chapter Master to realize, in this hellish insectoid place, Poog's one-time criticism of him had been correct. Unthinking stubbornness served no one save the Imperium's foes. Yet still, even with this realization, Lysander could not bring himself to fall back from the fray. And as the battle raged around him, he sought an alternative. The captain's eyes tracked around the chamber, coming to rest on where lava trickled in from above. For a moment, he stared blankly, knowing he had hit upon the solution, but did not yet know what it was. It took a moment, but then it dawned on him. With an excited bark, he ordered the Centurions to ignore the Tyranids and concentrate their fire on the dully growing trail of magma. Las cannons fired as one, but to no effect. Twice. 3 times more they fired, but still nothing happened. Then, on the 4th volley, the ceiling buckled, and a vicious steam of magma dribbled down into the Tyranid swarms below. Still the Centurions fired. The breach widened, and the stream became a flood. Now the Norn Queen hissed and shrieked as the searing rocks splashed against her carapace and began to eat through, but she could not break free of her fleshy web. Magma was beginning to pool in the chamber's heart, and the Imperial fists were at last falling back, dragging their dead with them and retreating to the higher levels where Lysander had entered the chamber. With a terrible crash, a span of the ceiling gave way, and the Norn Queen plunged into the spreading lava pool. She was already dying, her innards incinerated by molten rock. But she fought for her life nonetheless, her limbs thrashing madly amongst the magma, until finally her body sank beneath the surface. As the Norn Queen perished, so too did every synapse creature for hundreds of Terran kilometers, killed by the shared psychic agony of their broodmother's death. On Bleak Ridge, some broods scurried for cover as their base instincts took over, while others hurled themselves forward in a feeding frenzy. All perished, if not at that moment, then in the following days when the rest of the Imperial Fist arrived at Drashin, and a thorough scourging of the world began. Far away, the Tyranids assailing Drashin's remaining cities rode out the agony of the Norn Queen's death, but the swarms withdrew all the same, vanishing deep into the jungles and caves to bedevil the planet for a long time to come. Though it had cost the Imperial Fist greatly, Drashin had been saved. And so, several days after the Norn Queen's death, the remainder of the Imperial Fist arrived from the warp, engaging in a war against the Orcs of Antigon, a campaign dubbed the Crusade of Steel. They had responded immediately to Poog's summons, but had found their fleet harried by Craft World Eldari vessels launched from the Craft World Siam Han. Faced with the choice of abandoning a portion of his strength to the raiders, or delaying his arrival at Drashin, the Second Company's Captain Hellion had chosen to follow protocol and vanquish the immediate threat first. Had it not been for the interference of the Craft World Eldari, the Imperial Fist would have stood united at Drashin, and there was not a battle brother in the newly arrived fleet who did not blame the Eldari for their chapter master's death. Unable to vent their wrath against those deemed most deserving of it, the Imperial Fist threw themselves into the purging of the surviving Tyranids from Drashin's surface, moving with such implacable vigor that little of the work was left for the hard-bitten veterans of the Catachan 31st. Through it all, the Adeptus Mechanicus offered little assistance, although 3 knights of House Krast did go against their orders and take to the field at the Space Marine's side on several occasions. As the purging of Drashin continued, more somber duties were performed. Vladimir Poog's body was sent back to the Phalanx, so that his bones might be prepared as a relic for the ages to come. Some thought Darnath Lysander the perfect successor, considering that his previous errors had been washed away by his deeds since. Yet Lysander refused the honor, knowing that he had not yet learned the lessons of his recent past and could not take the chapter master's seat until he had done so. Instead, he reclaimed the captaincy of the First Company, which was now leaderless, again following acting Captain Julian's death at Poog's side. The decision was therefore deferred until the business of Drashin could be concluded. However, Sergeant Garridon's rise to the captaincy of the Third Company was immediate. Poog was not the only brother who fell to the Tyranids, but here the Imperial Fist had been fortunate. Rollo Dorn's legacy of blood and bone ensured that every 4 warriors who had fallen, only 1 had perished. The others, coaxed back from oblivion's brink by the apothecary's skill, would yet live to serve their chapter. Some would do so only with the aid of bionic implants. Others, like Captain Terrell amongst them, would be forced by their injuries to take up other duties on the Phalanx, rather than continue as active battle brothers. Nevertheless, of some 100 or so Space Marines who had fallen on Bleak Ridge, or within the Space Hulk, almost 70 would fight again. As the unbloodied company spread out across Drashin in search of Tyranid infestation, Captain Garridon oversaw the investigation of the Space Hulk's half-sunken remains. Working in concert with the Polar Base's engine seers, Tech Marines dug their way through the vessel, looking for some clue as to what had brought the vessel to Drashin. At first, it was assumed that the Tyranids had merely infested the Space Hulk, but this was quickly discovered to be untrue. The site where Poog had fallen was not an infested star vessel, but a mangled hive ship, concealed by the asteroids and spacecraft compacted around it. Clearly, the creatures had broken free during transit and slaughtered the Hulk's crew, who, in a development too unlikely to be a coincidence, bore the same glyphs as the orcs of the Magor Rift that Lysander had been fighting during the Crusade of Thunder. But who had captured the Tyranids in the first place? And why? The colorations of the beasts matched no configuration yet observed by Imperial forces, which was worrying enough. The Hive Fleet, codenamed Behemoth, had more or less run its course some solar decades earlier, and the thought that there were other Tyranid fleets converging on the galaxy was a worrying one. After a solar day of careful investigation, the searchers discovered an emaciated remains of a navigator. He was imprisoned within the Space Hulk's drive units by a many-tendrilled cyber cradle, and protected by a force field that withstood all attempts of breach for more than a solar week. When the force field was finally dissolved, the navigator died at once, killed by some suicidal mechanism within the cradle. Further investigation of the navigator's cybernetic interfaces revealed that Drashin had not been the Space Hulk's intended destination. The original course had been set for Terra, and it seemed likely that the navigator had been able to resist his implants just enough to throw the vessel from its intended heading. Though bound body and mind, he'd still found a way to serve the Emperor. Gyrodon was sure that the defenses around the Sol system would have prevented the Space Hulk doing to Terra what it had done to Drashin, but that did not diminish the plan's audacity. With the navigator's death, it seemed that no one would ever know the architect of Drashin's woes. However, as the wreck of the Space Hulk was broken apart for salvage, a brass naming plaque was found emblazoned on the ancient Horus Heresy-era cruiser, embedded at its heart, and it simply read, Hydros. The meaning of this name was lost on Gyrodon and his fellow captains, but not so on Lysander. It was a word he knew all too well. In the ancient legends upon which Warsmith Shon'tu had styled himself, Hydros had been the warlord's spear. When thrown, it had unleashed an all-consuming plague that devoured everything in its path. Lysander only knew of this because it had been one of the legends Shon'tu had recounted during the terrible days on the Iron Warrior's fortress world of Madrax, but he knew at once it wasn't a coincidence. If the Tyranid swarm had taken full root on Drashin, or worse yet on Terra, a new Hive Fleet might have one day grown into the Imperium's very heart. Upon the chapter's return to the Phalanx, Lysander's fellow captains again made the attempt to have him take Vladimir Pug's place. This time, Lysander gave the matters more careful consideration. The Imperial Fist needed leadership. That much was true, but some instinct gnawed at the first captain's heart. Unable to resolve the matter through conscious thought, Lysander spent many solar days silently meditating in the Cloister of Remembrance. On the fifth such day, Haldor Marzon, the chapter's chief librarian and Pug's closest confidant, intruded upon Lysander's gloom-laden solitude. There, the mystic explained that Pug's orders for the Crusade of Thunder to strike the orcs of the Magor Rift was not the censure that it had first seemed. During his long years of service, the chapter master had forged many allies throughout the Imperium, and possibly beyond. Since Shon'tu's escape from the destruction of Madrax, Pug had used those connections to uncover any information he could concerning Shon'tu's plans. Though the chapter master had never succeeded in locating Shon'tu's base of operations, he had uncovered many of the Warsmith's allies, and set his chapter to the business of their destruction. The strike in the Magor Rift, Marzon explained, had been the latest in a long line of similar actions. Upon hearing this, when Lysander convened the chapter council, it was to refuse the position of chapter master once again. To the surprise of all there gathered, the captain spared nothing of his pride, and explained that he had learnt of Pug's actions, and the flaws within his own character. Lysander announced that he would never serve as chapter master so long as Shon'tu still lived. So long as the Warsmith strode the stars, Lysander knew he would never be certain of his own judgment. The chapter council accepted his decision with reserved dismay, but they could defer the matter of the chapter master's appointment no longer. After much debate, the rank was finally bestowed upon Vorn Hagen, captain of the Fifth Company. No sooner had the appointment been made than Captain Gyrodon stepped forth. The Third Company wished to see their crusade completed, not against the orcs of the Magor Rift, but against he who had been revealed as their paymaster, Warsmith Shon'tu. Shon'tu had cast his spear, Gyrodon announced, but it had flown awry, and it was now time for vengeance to find him. Techmarine Karazhan had recovered fragments of a nav data from the Hydros system, and thus discovered the Space Hulk's point of origin was Madrax. The Warsmith had returned to his old lair. Gyrodon spoke forcefully and eloquently, reminding all that so many of the Imperial Fist's recent woes could be laid at Shon'tu's feet, that Pug's blood lay as heavily on the Warsmith's hands as it did on the talons of the Tyranids. As Gyrodon spoke, he saw Lysander nod approvingly, and that affirmation made him doubt his cause. He had learned much from the first captain in recent months, but had he also been captured by Lysander's blind obsession? It seemed that Vorn Hagen believed so, for he denied Gyrodon's request. He would not, Hagen said calmly, allow his inaugural act to bring about the ruin of the Third Company. Lysander muttered darkly at this response, and Gyrodon, acutely aware of his recent elevation to captain's rank, remained silent. However, Hagen's next order surprised them both. Turning to Lysander, he bade the first captain make the phalanx ready for departure. Pug would be avenged. Shon'tu would be humbled, and the chapter would fight as one. The Crusade of Thunder would end as it had begun, in battle against one of the Imperial Fist's greatest foes. Yet, as the chapter council dissolved, and Lysander went to oversee the ritual that would rouse the phalanx from its decades-long dormancy, he realized that Hagen's manor likely had a need for vengeance that burned at least as strong as Garradon's. Anything could await them at Madrax, and even the phalanx was not indestructible. Thus, Lysander sought out Apostolary Darnath. When the first captain had faced Shon'tu in battle before, he had been too proud to request aid. He would not make that mistake again. And to that end, he sent a message out to those among the other Astartes chapters he knew would be willing to lend their aid to see Shon'tu destroyed, including Captain Erasmus Tycho of the Blood Angels and Captain Cato Sicarius of the Ultramarines. None would rest until the fortress world of Madrax had fallen to the Emperor's vengeance. And so Lysander's call was answered, and the Imperial Fist was joined by the Ultramarines cruiser Valen's Revenge, and 3 Blood Angels Ascalon-class frigates under Tycho. The Iron Warrior Defenders were joined by Orc allies, who Shon'tu had previously armed in exchange for slaves. The largest craft in the trader's fleet was Shon'tu's own flagship, the ancient Wobaku, Tamanash. The Phalanx and Tamanash began to exchange fire with one another, and it became apparent that the demonic vessel could regenerate damage it sustained by using umbilical-like cords connected to the surface of Madrax, where a vat of souls powered its repair. The Imperial Fist thus realized they would have to assault Madrax itself before winning the space battle. Tor Garradon would lead his forces on boarding torpedoes to assault the Tamanash, while Lysander's first company would remain in reserve, ready to deploy wherever needed. However, Shon'tu was able to use psychers to stir the warp to interfere with communications of Astartes on board the vessel. Using this to their advantage, the traitors and orcs launched a fierce counterattack against the Imperial Fist with not only infantry, but also hulking hellbrutes and mauler fiends. Yet Garradon had an ace up his sleeve, one Apostolary Darnath, who helped guide him and his company through the vessel amid the carnage. It soon became apparent to Garradon that the automated defenses throughout the ship were demonic in nature and fed upon the orcs' rage. The greenskins weren't crew, so much as fuel to power the ship's defenses. Regardless of the twists and turns Darnath led the third company, they eventually came to a chamber dominated by a ridged umbilical cable that burst through the floor. They were joined by Tycho's forces in the chamber, who had boarded the demonic Barku themselves. After battling through more swarms of orcs, they finally secured the chamber. The Marines set charges to the umbilical that fed back to Madrax, destroying it and cutting off Tamanash from its power source of souls. Just then, another Iron Warrior squad arrived, with Mauler Fiends at the lead. Tycho and the Blood Angels held their ground, urging the Imperial Fist to leave this battle to them. Reluctantly, Garradon agreed, and by this point the Tamanash, having lost its regenerative capabilities, began to take real damage in its battle against the Phalanx. Garradon next found the chamber holding Shon'tu's psychers, destroying them and freeing the Loyalists from the warp interference they produced. These acts, along with the Ultramarines' own boarding party on the Tamanash, disabled multiple weapon systems, proving to be a turning point in the battle. Finally, Imperial Fist Centurions were able to lead a breach into Shon'tu's command deck. Encountering Shon'tu himself, the Warsmith fought with a vicious fury. Garradon struck down Shon'tu's bodyguard before battling the Warsmith himself, and to his horror realized he could not defeat the mighty Chaos Marine. However, due to the end of the warp interference on the Tamanash, Garradon was able to activate his teleportation Homer beacon and call reinforcements to the scene, a portion of the first company under Lysander. Now once more the hated enemies Shon'tu and Lysander did battle, and Lysander managed to land a critical blow that forced the Warsmith to scatter away. As Lysander was about to deliver the final blow, a force of Iron Warriors chosen blocked his path. Shon'tu reached his control panel, activating a warp portal to destroy the entire Tamanash and the Imperial Fist within it. Shon'tu used the distraction as an opportunity to escape yet again, and Lysander rescued the wounded Garradon and fled the collapsing vessel. With the Tamanash destroyed, the Phalanx moved into position above the Madrax and enacted Exterminatus, winning the day. Now, unfortunately, Darnath Lysander would never claim Shon'tu's death. And that took place many years later when the Iron Warriors tried to take the Phalanx during the 13th Black Crusade, and was killed by Sergeant Furion of the 3rd Company. Now, if you want to know more about that, check out our Vox on notable Iron Warriors characters called
Iron Within, Iron Without.
Well now, this is where I will leave you fine folks. Now, before I go, you may be wondering, what is Darnath up to now that his arch-enemy is pushing up daisies? Well, he's doing what he's always done, commanding the 1st Company and hunting down and destroying the enemies of the Imperium. And with that, that'd be all, folks. If you enjoyed this Vox, please like, follow, and subscribe. And if you wish to help us expand our work on 40k lore, by all means, support us by joining our membership program on our YouTube channel,
Tales of Ashwaka.
Have a great day, and as always,
until next time, this is Zeckthar, signing off.